This is Module 4, Part 3 of the Foundations of Programming with Python video series. In this part I will continue talking about tuples and demonstrating you a few things about tuples. We will be doing 2 labs related to tuples, and then ranges are going to be in Part 4. So let's get started right into it. The first thing is I want you to consider working with tuple with multiple dimensions. So what does this mean? Think about how you're organizing your data, for example, in a spreadsheet. So if you're creating an inventory in there, you would be having columns with names on them, what you're holding in there, and then you have your rows in your table where the actual data is. And we can do the same thing with creating multidimensional, or in this case 2-dimensional tuples. So what we're doing here is we are creating a tuple data row 1 that has certain values, then we are creating a tuple data row 2 which has certain values. Both of them are tuples. And then we are creating a tuple table. So what this means is we are creating a tuple that is holding tuples in it with the rows. So if we are running this, what actually comes out, if we are just printing out this tuple, we are printing out a tuple, which is the outer brackets here. This is our table tuple, and the first entry in this tuple is actually a tuple, and the second entry is another tuple. So those are our rows, and within the inner tuple we then have the actual values for each row. This nested for loop that I put in here is, so I'm going through each individual row in the table, and then I'm going through each column of this row, and I'm printing this column. And because I have actually 2 rows in here and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 values per row, I have 5 times 2. I'm running 5 times 2 this print operation. So this down here should be 10 lines. And as you can see, we are actually getting those 10 lines printed out. So this print statement is being run 10 times. The outer for loop is going through the rows, so this tuple here and then this tuple. And then for each of those, it is actually staying in here and going through the columns. So I want you to very clearly understand this concept. This is a very, very common concept that you're seeing in programming, that you're iterating over multidimensional data structures. With a tuple, it's relatively straightforward and a relatively simple construct. So make sure that you are understanding on this example this principle, the logic behind that principle, not the programming syntax. This has to be to do with the understanding the logic, the logical approach here. Make sure that you're understanding it. It is important that you are certain to understand this. And by the way, there is no limit to the number of dimensions that you can create. So you can create a tuple in 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 a tuple, if you so like. The problem there is actually being able to follow the logic behind it. It gets very confusing very quickly. that is why I'm stressing this. Make sure you're understanding this concept of the two-dimensional tuple here. We are going to be working with this all over the place all the time. From now on, make sure this is a fundamental that you really need to understand. And because it's so fundamental, we are actually going to be jumping right into the Lab 4B. So the Lab 4B is asking you to take this data and uses a 2D tuple to hold this data. And then create the loop to actually go through there and display it in this way. That is the first step. The second step, what I'm going to be asking you to do, is to now go in here and extend the script to have this data, and then go through the outer tuple and then through each inner tuple to actually print out this information. And then for repetition, in your own words, describe and write down how your code works and really work this through. This is essential. After this lab, we're going to be continuing with tuples, and tuples are immutable, which means, like with the strings, or same as the strings, you can't change the content of a tuple after its creation. That is now a node that is explaining a little bit on the background. This means changing data that is stored in tuples, because you need to change the tuples. And changing tuples means creating new tuples and assigning them for the existing variable, is, for processing-wise, a relatively expensive way of handling data. You as the developer or as the user are not aware of that. It is invisible to you, but it is happening under the hood within Python. So using tuples for changing data is an expensive way, computational expensive way of handling this task, and probably not the best option. So let's quickly have a look how you can add to a tuple, just that we can have a look at all the handling of a tuple. But keep in mind that changing tuples is, in a large scale, is costly, processing costly. So we have this piece of code here. So we are creating a tuple, we're printing the tuple, and then we are creating a tuple for adding to a tuple. Then we're adding this tuple to our tuple and print the new tuple. So let's see how this is running, and it actually works. Now there are a few interesting small pieces in here. The first thing is, we can't add to a tuple data and just add a string. It does not work. You can't use the plus operator. You remember, a plus operator is an overloaded operator, and you can't use them between a tuple data type and a string data type. It simply is not going to be working, because it is not clear what is meant with this plus operation. You can access a tuple's values by index, but you can't modify values in a tuple by index, by assigning to an index. Same as with a string, exactly the same, doesn't work. Also, to add a tuple to a tuple, this code here does not work. Because remember, parentheses are overloaded operators. And the prime use of parentheses is actually creating a hierarchy and an order of execution. So what we're doing here is we are defining that whatever happens with the string here is the highest order of execution. So we are making a string here is the highest execution, and then we are doing tuple adding string, same as here. That's why it does not work. These parentheses do not create a tuple. What we need to do instead is, if we only have one value, we have to add a trailing comma. By adding this trailing comma to a single value, we indicate to Python that we want these parentheses to create a tuple. They are no longer order of execution, they are creating a tuple. That is the overloading of the parentheses that we want to have here. And then I have noted it in a few scripts so far. I'm actually using it in this script here, just the plus equal operator, which is a shorthand for tuple data equals tuple data plus tuple add. So we are using this one here to add this one here and then assigning it to this variable. This is what the plus equal is doing. Next step, or next part, is the in operator. So we're creating two tuples here, two rows of data, and then we can check if chain row is in tuple row 1. Then we're printing person found, otherwise person not found. And then we are checking if chain row is in tuple row 2, we're printing person found or person not found. So theoretically we should be getting as a response, once I'm running it, one line person found and then person not found. So let's see what we get. There it is, person found and person not found. So with this in operator, we can check if this item here, this value, is in this sequence. Same with not in, actually. So a lab for C is asking you to create a script using a 2D tuple with these 3 rows. That is your explanation of what everything is. And then it is asking you, then create the data structure of a 2D tuple with those rows. Create a for loop that is going through your rows and actually just printing out the tuple. And then it's asking you to enter an ID, so ask for an input of an ID, and I'm giving an ID, and then go through your 2D data structure and check if for this ID I asked for 2, and then you're printing out this row in a formatted fashion in this way. This is what this lab is, working with 2D tuples and using checking for values in tuples. And last step, as usual, in your own words, describe and write down how your code works. With this, I'm concluding part 3 of module 4 of the Foundations of Programming with Python video series, and I will be seeing you in a bit in part 4.